All right, thanks everyone for joining us. Today I have John Genter here, the Chief Information Security Officer for Lightspeed Systems. I'm Matthew Burg, the Principal Product Manager for Lightspeed Filter, and we're going to have a great chat today. Just talk about cybersecurity, why it's important for K through 12, talk about some of the common things that I think people really need to be thinking about, and ultimately what Lightspeed can do to even help in that process as well. So without further ado, let's jump in. I guess we'll just start with really why is cybersecurity so important for K through 12, but also what makes it, I would say, a unique challenge for them?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a great question. Why is it important? Clearly, the type of data that schools hold, data specific to students and to staff, make it a very important subject for schools. When I think about what makes it unique, I think about attack surface and the fact that schools deal with a much bigger population internally that's a threat to them, whether it's intentional or unintentional, than businesses do. So businesses often deal with just external hackers. But schools have students that are curious and are out trying and exploring and hitting the web and potentially bringing malware and other things into the school district. So I think that's a bit unique on what schools deal with as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I remember a couple of years back, I was reading a Cisco threat report, and they had actually mentioned in there that it's about 10 times more likely that you're going to have ransomware, malware, phishing, like those kinds of threats, 10 times more likely just from your web activity in your own environment, right? And so
Mhm.
oftentimes I think we think about there's so many things right under the umbrella of cybersecurity, and I think there's a lot of really important things to consider. But at the end of the day, just good old fashioned how you're browsing and what you're clicking on, what links and where you're going ends up being such a significant contributing factor. And to your point, unlike a normal business, which is what the Cisco report was based on, think about the difference in ratio of maybe less educated digital citizens when it comes to navigating the web and kind of figuring out what they're clicking on within these networks. So I guess I'm curious then, from your perspective and thinking about kind of that broad sort of nature of this, what are some of the things that you would say, and I don't know if you have any, stats or other information from this, that lead to incidents, right? Because is it coming from the students in that activity? Like, what are the kinds of things that really we're seeing actually lead all the way down to a full cybersecurity incident?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do read quite a bit on this space. There was a report, I believe it was put out by Comparatech here recently, that in the first quarter, they've seen like a 69% increase in ransomware attacks targeted to global education. And that's pretty significant. Um,
Yeah.
and then the Center for Internet Security reported just at the beginning of this year that for the time period between July of 23 and December of 24, they interviewed schools and found that 82% of the schools had experienced some sort of cyber incident. That doesn't
Wow.
necessarily mean it was a data breach or what have you, but there was some sort of incident that required schools to address and took time away, probably from the IT teams, but maybe even from the classroom and instruction. Um, and what do we see? There's a lot of noise in the space right now. And it's very interesting to track, but we're talking about quantum computing and what that's going to mean. And we're talking about AI and what that's done and how it's changing the landscape. I like to think about it as FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And there's a whole bunch of that going on right now. Um, but I follow a few folks in the space. And if we look back over the last few years, what we see, and maybe even if we just focus on education, say for the last 5 months, and we look at what has happened there and the breaches that have been reported, it hasn't been AI, it hasn't been quantum. What it's been is failure to use some of the fundamental things like MFA on exposed portals or having weak passwords that were easy to understand and break. Also, it's things like falling for phishing emails, and it's people who are going to websites. This will sound a lot like students, right? That they think are legit but are not. And when they download off of that website, they end up with malware, ransomware, virus software on their computers. So it's still very much those traditional ways that people have been compromised in the past that we continue to see even right now as the top drivers.
Do you think that stems from people thinking that, like, something's good enough, right? They think that, whether it's a firewall is in place or, whatever it might be, that it's fine, or is it more from third party or things that are external to what the school is doing themselves? And I guess, can you speak a little bit around to kind of what the sources of these issues are? Because to your point, it seems like, MFA, it's been around for ages and everyone should be doing it, but that obviously isn't the case.
It is not the case. I think some of it is that third parties or part of the school supply chains haven't been as good as stewards with things as they should be. For instance, leaving portals exposed, not protected by MFA. And look, MFA isn't the end all be all, but it's certainly a significant improvement over not having it. I think also we talk about schools and staff that are just taxed and pressed with lots of things. There's interesting dynamics in schools that you don't necessarily have in corporations. So MFA may be something that schools want to do, but maybe they have a bargaining unit or someone else that they have to deal with in order to get all that pushed through. So that takes a little longer to get out. And students probably just don't understand the significance of it. And in some cases, when we think about kindergartners and all, maybe don't even have the wherewithal to be able to use that technology. So it is a bit of a unique challenge that schools face. But MFA is a pretty significant first step and pretty fairly easy to implement to help add a significant level of protection.
Okay, yeah. I guess putting you on a spot a little bit here, to that point of MFA, are there other things that kind of jump to mind when you sort of think, like, what are the essential things, right, that need to be figured out? And if not, where can districts go to learn and really understand better ways to kind of secure not just themselves but their vendors and otherwise?
Sure, the Center for Internet Security does a real good job. OWASP does a good job of publishing out uh, top tens and things that we should do. I think for schools, again, understanding the challenges they face, and I spent 22 years of my life as a school board trustee, and I understand some of the unique challenges that the IT team at schools faced, and a large part of it is time, and some of it is resources in the human perspective. But I think it is culturally getting people to understand and believe that while they don't have to be security experts, security is part of their job and part
Mm,
of what they need to understand. I think it is making sure you train people to ask questions and be more curious about things that come in. Do I know this person? Should I get it? Bit challenging for schools too, though, right? Because their community often are people they don't know.
yeah.
But just really understanding that, making sure that they don't use the same password over and over and over, right? Making sure they don't have weak passwords, certainly a good filter product that would help IT make sure that students aren't able to download from nefarious websites and all is important. I think those are all keys and things I would recommend.
Okay, yeah. And actually, let's talk about that, because you mentioned at the start of this, the unique challenge with students and really kind of to your business analogy, right? You can't just let somebody go for too many offenses, or something along those lines, right? It's very a very different world there. But when you think about cybersecurity and you think about, some of these standards that are coming in from NIST and otherwise,
Mhm.
the word zero trust or the term zero trust comes around,
Yeah.
and it's something that I've found interesting as the sort of the filter product manager, because there's an interesting balance between the desire for maximizing security as it pertains to your business, your operation, your data, all these different things, but also your duty to allow effective and really making sure that students can get to the education resources they need to, and not creating so many barriers to which that becomes a problem. And so I'm curious, from your point of view, when you think about zero trust and the tenants there within, how does that play into kind of how K through 12 should implement it or not? And yeah, I'm just curious your take on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And zero trust. Zero trust, that's a big term. What does it mean? And I know it can be confusing for folks, and it can mean a lot of different things to people depending on who you talk to and all. When I think about zero trust, I think about it as simply, trust but verify kind of mindset, making sure that when someone tries to log in, we'll talk MFA again, right? You have that in place. So you verify they're actually who they are supposed to be, that they have the rights to access. Um, I think it's things in a student's world, right? Making sure that your endpoints don't have admin rights on it, right? Making sure that students can't accidentally or intentionally download something onto that device that then has consequences on your network that you don't expect. So, locking down that endpoint is really important. I think it's important as we think about endpoints and zero trust that we expand it beyond maybe just the login, which a lot of times people will think of, but we also think about it, and we talked filter earlier, right? Which is, let's make sure that we have a list of known good sites that students can get to. And if we don't know what that site is, we don't trust it until we know what it is. We don't allow anybody to download an app and just install it and run it in our network. We want to understand, is it trustworthy? What kind of data does it collect? Is it something safe to use? And having tooling around that can help make that easier and help you do it quickly, I think is very important.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned at the start of that, really does extend into other facets that maybe aren't necessarily zero trust, but also sometimes zero trust is thought of as things that are different person to person. And it really, I think, makes me think about that. There's lots of standards for security. There's lots of things you can do. I think zero trust is obviously a very important thing, and it's the latest and greatest. But all of these things can be implemented right on a gradient, right? You don't have to do literally everything, and it might not be relevant for you, but that doesn't mean that you're not being secure. You kind of take a different approach, maybe for securing this part of your platform versus this other one, maybe that's more critical. Maybe you take a more holistic zero trust type approach and that sort of thing. This has been something I've been researching a lot in the context of filter, because you think about, devices are with students and they're going home and they're going places. And there's a lot of, I think, things that you could do to make them more secure when it comes to just absolutely ensuring never ever having a problem. But the trade-off then is that they're not able to do their homework and that they can't log into their home Wi-Fi, right? And you're creating some of these other challenges. And so we've created tools like, whether it's scheduling for after school rules, or obviously we have our categorization system.
Mhm.
We have a lot of things that kind of help support, I think, a lot of those basics and those core requirements, for whether it's location based, changing kind of how they're being filtered or otherwise. But it is a big challenge, because we're always kind of on this fine line when it comes to the student piece of it, of how do we not cause more harm, right? How do we not cause more harm than good? But I think it's interesting, because then when you think back on like vendor responsibilities, how does the business operate, right, and secure the data from that said product? You mentioned earlier about how some of those challenges, some of those ways that we've seen incidents occur is from MFA. And it's like, you might have the most secure tool for the students, but if you're not securing yourself as a vendor, right, then you're creating an even worse problem, frankly. I'm curious your reaction to that, and kind of if you can speak a little bit to kind of what is Lightspeed doing, right? In that arguably more important responsibility and role of being secure as a vendor, so that districts can trust us.
Yeah, that's a great question. Lightspeed's a unique. I think Lightspeed's a unique company, and I think it's really important how many former teachers and IT folks that we have that work here who have sat in those chairs and understand what those challenges are. Um, and I think I look at it and I just share with everybody in the teams is we cannot be the reason somebody is focused on something other than what's happening in the classroom and educating in the classroom, right? So it's making sure that we are an excellent partner. That means that we run security reviews on a regular basis. It means that all these things we talked about, MFA, least privileges, all those things we implement and we use. It means culturally we look at security as our responsibility, even though they're not expected to be the expert in security, but expected to throw a flag. Nothing makes me happier than when I get an email from somebody that said, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know I got this email today, and it looks like phishing or what have you." And it's really wonderful for me to see people care that much and really take that part of it at heart. It's implementing the tooling. It's scanning. It's doing vendor reviews of our vendors. It's addressing the findings when you get them. And no one's perfect in this space. It's a challenge because we're all producing a lot of code and we need to scan it regularly. We need to look at it. And we have good practices, but sometimes things show up and we need to address those when we find those. And we look very hard to catch all those before anything would ever get into production. But we hire third parties to come in and pen test and look at our solutions, and they find some things and we take care of them. And I think that's all part of, for me, what it takes to just be a good partner to our school customers.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, to your point, we see it firsthand. We know and are very aware of what kind of data that we have, right? It's just be by the very nature of the type of products that we offer. And so, I know that it's been, for me at least, really, really great to see, just even in the last few years, the ongoing steady increase in support, even from a leadership side of pushing for more and more, on the security front and prioritizing that anywhere and everywhere where it's possible. So, I believe we have a place on the website where folks can learn more if they are curious. I think it's a Lightspeed Systems trust page. I don't remember the URL
That's
offhand.
correct.
Um,
Lightspeedsystems.com/trust. We built this page a few years ago. We continue to update it. It's our way to want to make sure anybody in the community who wants to go see what's our privacy practices, what are our security practices, are out there and visible. And we want to make sure that folks feel comfortable with what we're doing. And certainly, if they have any questions, they can always reach out to security@lightspeedsystems.com, and we'll be happy to answer questions that aren't answered on that page.
awesome. Well, thank you, John. I guess just in closing out, just a reminder for everyone as far as where they could go to learn more. As far as you mentioned a few institutions that offer information on cybersecurity. Can you go through those one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Center for Internet Security, CIS, is really important. They do a real good job of gathering information and sharing it out. I also think OWASP, for anybody who is working in the kind of tech space, and maybe if you're even buying from vendors, the kinds of things that OWASP say are the top 10 security, and that's the OWASP is how that's spelled. I think those are a couple of good resources, ones that I refer to pretty regularly.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. If there's one takeaway I think I sort of get from this is that, really it's all about striving to be better, right? There's no way to do everything 100% perfect, and there's too much gray area and wiggle room, and we're trying to toe a fine line. But figure out what weak points you feel like you have, and try to learn more and see what you can do to make that better each day. And we're all in this together and trying to make sure that the students out there are staying safe and learning. So, and it's a tough thing to balance it sometimes. So, thanks very much for your time, John, and thank you everyone who's joining and listening to this today. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. It's been fun.